Good day. So let's get into some Shakespearean tragedy. Isn't it tragic? Let's go. So, I'm going to give you some background and go pretty far back, but I'm going to go a little bit quickly and not read through all of this. I think that you can see that drama starts with Aristotle, one of our premier Greek philosophers. And so you can sort of read those quotes for yourself and what the goal of uh, tragedy is, sort of arousing that pity and fear, which has to do with catharsis. The word tragedy refers primarily to tragic drama. The tragic hero is a literary composition written to be performed by actors in which a central character called a tragic protagonist or hero suffers some sort of misfortune. With meaningful misfortune, the misfortune is not accidental and therefore is meaningful. And then however, it is significant in that the misfortune is logically connected with the hero's actions. Often we refer to this as hubris, the fatal flaw, which is hubris. A simple definition, tragedy is a play that ends in death and violence. I mean, they can be pretty gruesome. And it's a spoiler alert every time because almost everybody's going to die, particularly in a Shakespeare play. It appeals to pathos. The best of the tragedies, however, do more than simply bring us death and violence. They affect our emotions by appealing to our pity and fear, per Aristotle. We pity the outcome of the characters, and yet at the same time, we identify so closely with them that we fear the same circumstances could happen to us. Tragedy stresses the vulnerability of human beings whose suffering is brought on by a combination of human and divine action. And so is it fate? Is it divination? Is it the hand of God? Is it our own free will? Is it the human element? So we get to think about all those things. This genre, however, is not totally pessimistic in its outlook. Although many tragedies end in misery for the characters, there are also tragedies in which a satisfactory solution of the tragic situation is attained. So there's a few different types of tragedy, and I think we will just go through them a little bit here. The nemesis tragedies start with the strong and powerful and show how they are also victims of fate and have to fall to the same death, destruction, or decay as all of the rest of humanity. Christopher Marlowe was a mentor of Shakespeare who wrote several plays in this style, and including one of his most famous, which was Tamburlaine. Wheel of Fortune tragedy. This is interesting. We've got, it deals with innocent victims caught up in a tragic situation they simply do not deserve. It's the rise and fall. Fortune is a wheel. It's the goddess of fortune, and the wheel goes up and down, similar to how you sort of see in this image here. When you're down here, fortune is not looking on you favorably, but as the wheel spins, if you're up here, then fortune is being kind to you. And it's similar to Wheel of Fortune. This is what they're talking about on that television show. Some modern students see the star-crossed lovers of Romeo and Juliet as our best example of Wheel of Fortune tragic heroine in Shakespeare. Revenge tragedy. This is where we've got the use of ghosts and supernatural messages to goad the tragic hero into revenge, usually for a murder of an important family member. Shakespeare's Hamlet is a perfect example of this. And then Senecan tragedy refers to a set of ancient Roman tragedies written by Stoic philosopher and politician Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who is thought to have written 8 of the 10 plays that still exist in 1st century AD. It became the model for the revival of tragedy on the Renaissance stage, especially for Elizabethan tragedy, which is what Shakespeare writes. It has themes of bloodthirsty revenge in it. There's a lot of unnecessary violence and slaughter, most of which is really off stage because it's difficult during this time and Shakespeare's time to show all of the special effects, so to speak. Contains long reflective soliloquies. And then Shakespeare's later play, Julius Caesar, is a good example of this kind of tragedy. Contrary to Plato, Aristotle asserts that the artist does not just copy the shifting appearances of the world, but rather imitates or represents reality itself and gives form and meaning to that reality. In so doing, the artist gives shape to the universal, not the accidental. And so this is how Aristotelian tragedy alters a bit. The action is serious in that it raises and purifies pity and fear, as well as in a moral, psychological, and social sense. Imitation is important here, as the artist does not just immediately copy everything related to an action, but selects or represents only those aspects that give form to universal truths. And so it's not just a series of episodes, but a whole with a beginning, middle, and end. So there's catharsis, as I mentioned earlier, the purification or purging of the raised emotions of pity and fear throughout the tragedy. The spectator is purged as a result of the watching of the hero fall. The hero is neither a villain nor a model of perfection, but is basically good and decent, is also one who stands in great repute and often prosperity, is usually of high class standing, prominence in the society. Hamartia, in a tragedy, the tragic hero undergoes a change of misfortune, not through any real villainy or wickedness, but because of some mistake, or in the Greek hamartia, that is translated as flaw or error, that tragic flaw, right? And hubris, one of the most common forms of tragic flaws in Greek tragedies, was hubris, and that's pride, or overweening self-confidence, which leads a protagonist to disregard a divine warning or to violate an important law. However, the gods or fate are also in some sense responsible for the hero's fall. Emphasizes moral choices and are considered by scholars to be the most mature of the tragic dramas. And of course, you might think of Othello as an excellent example of Aristotelian tragedy. We are sympathetic with Othello, but have to admit he's responsible for the deaths of a number of people. So in Shakespeare, there's a 5-act paradigm that begins in the Christian era. And so you've got, it's the 5-act paradigm. And then you've got this 5-act play being used in, or paradigm being used in all of Shakespearean plays and in most of those of his contemporaries. And the main proponent of this approach was Seneca, the famous Greek tragedian that I spoke of earlier, whose plays were studying in the universities of England. And so what you're going to see, and I want you to keep this in mind as you're reading the plays, we're in the midst of rising action with the first 2 acts. And so you're getting the setting, the scene, the characters starting to work toward the climax. Typically in Act 3, we'll see the climax. In some plays of Shakespeare, maybe Antony and Cleopatra specifically, we might have some of the climax carry over even later. And some might even say it's the climax, even with the death, is happening in Act 5 sometimes in plays. But typically, most scholars identify Act 3 as having the climax, and then we move into the denouement and then into the conclusion. So I'm just going to let you read these for yourself. But these might be things to look for as you're reading and to see, do you agree or disagree with the Act 3 climax in the first 3 plays that we'll be discussing that are tragedies. So here are the elements in Shakespeare's plays that define and sort of are attributes of what a Shakespearean tragedy is. And so when we're going into the attributes of the tragic hero, you can sort of see, we've talked about this a little bit, but I want you to think about in each of the plays as you're reading them, who do you think the tragic hero is? Is there only one? And why is that? And eventually, tragic heroes, remember I said earlier, they're kind of often on a pedestal, and they're certainly in a place of prominence in society and well respected and esteemed. But because of their tragic flaw, because of often hubris, but could it be a different flaw, they end up falling from that high spot. And the idea is that if people of prominence, people of wealth, people of power are susceptible to hubris or are susceptible to fate or God or can be punished in some way, how much more is the average person beholden to those laws of nature, God, or fate? So that's something to consider. And so I want you to think about who, do you think Cleopatra might be another tragic hero or the tragic hero, or is it Antony? It is called Antony and Cleopatra after all. And then what are the tragic flaws? I think I'm missing a word here. How about Antony and Cleopatra is what that was supposed to say there. So the reversal of fortune, this is an important idea about how the fickleness of fortune often, that one needs to respect the goddess fortune, honor the goddess fortune, but can also see how fickle fortune is, because it's just the spinning of the wheel, and what goes up must come down. And this fatal flaw brings the hero from that elevated state up here to, yikes, holding on for dear life down here. So ultimately, it's pretty interesting because in Shakespeare's plays, he's often calling out an element in his society that is infecting the people, that then becomes a part of the issue that leads to the tragedy. And by the end, part of the reason there's death and destruction is because whatever is ailing the society in the play is so detrimental that it has to be eliminated so that there can be a restoration of social order. And this fits in with some of the Elizabethan ideologies that you'll be reading about. And then also there's another video about it. And so even though we have this tragic ending with a lot of bodies sprinkling the stage, we've also got peace restored in some way, shape, or form. So there's some gender issues here with the plays, in that on the Elizabethan stage, it was illegal for women to act. So only male actors were playing female roles. And most of the critical personalities are masculine. You'll notice that there's more males identified in the titles of tragedies than women, but we do have Romeo and Juliet. We do have Antony and Cleopatra. And it's important to think about the significance of Cleopatra and what her role is, and if she doesn't take on even a larger role in some ways than Antony. And her death is important to the plot, and how she dies is quite significant.